The Bouviers claimed European aristocratic roots they never had. Jackie Kennedy's public identity was built on a manufactured genealogy authored by her own grandfather, a man who understood perfectly well that he was committing fraud. And Lee Radziwill held a princess title from Poland, a country that abolished aristocratic titles in its 1921 March Constitution, decades before Lee was even born. The styling was legally meaningless in every jurisdiction she ever inhabited. None of this was a misunderstanding. The lie was designed, distributed, and maintained across generations by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The Bouvier aristocracy was a conscious invention. Lee's princesshood was void from day one. And the only story worth telling here isn't the myth. It's what happened when the myth got handed down. Because some members of this family clung to a fictional pedigree like a life raft, and others quietly walked away from it and built something real. The architect of the whole fiction was John Vernou Bouvier Jr., Jackie's grandfather. Sometime in the early 20th century, he sat down and produced a book called Our Forebears, in which he concocted an essentially fictitious genealogy that depicted his remote French ancestors as titled aristocrats. A family genealogy is supposed to be a record. His was a blueprint, drafted and circulated among the Bouviers with the specific intent of repositioning a family of craftsmen and coal speculators as transplanted European nobility. And the critical detail, the one that separates this from ordinary social climbing, survives in the historical record. He did this knowing that what he was doing was issuing a false history to advance his social status. He understood the actual family records. He chose to overwrite them. The truth that Our Forebears was built to bury is considerably less glamorous and considerably more interesting. Michel Bouvier, the family patriarch who arrived in America in the early 19th century, was a carpenter conscripted to Napoleon's army. He came from much humbler stock than family legend had held. A craftsman who worked wood with his hands, swept into the Napoleonic Wars by conscription rather than commission, Michel fled to the United States during the political upheaval known as the White Terror. His wife, Louise Vernou, was the daughter of John Vernou, a French émigré tobacconist, and Elizabeth Clifford Lindsay, an American woman of no particular distinction. A carpenter married to the daughter of a tobacconist. That's who the Bouviers actually were. Michel settled in Philadelphia and became one of the city's notable cabinet makers during the golden age of furniture craft between 1820 and 1840. He built furniture with his hands, with no inherited privilege backing him up. Philadelphia in those decades was a center of American craftsmanship, and Michel Bouvier competed in a market alongside other skilled artisans, earning his reputation one commission at a time. Then he did something shrewd. He invested in Pennsylvania anthracite coal, and the returns were extraordinary, with annual royalties exceeding $50,000 by 1840. A skilled laborer in the 1840s earned a few $100s a year. Michel Bouvier's coal royalties alone dwarfed entire neighborhoods of working wages. His descendants, John Vernou Bouvier Sr. and Michel M.C. Bouvier, parlayed that industrial coal wealth into Wall Street prominence. Within a single generation, the family went from sawdust to stock certificates. They had the money and the social access. What they lacked was the lineage. And in the status-obsessed world of early 20th century East Coast society, lineage was the one thing money alone supposedly couldn't buy. John Vernou Bouvier Jr. proved that theory wrong. What money could buy was a book. He purchased that book with his own pen, rewriting his grandfather's carpentry shop into an aristocratic manner. Each generation that followed gilded the lie a little more thickly. Edith, Big Edie Bouvier Beale, Jackie's aunt, claimed the Bouviers were descended from 14th-century French kings. Michel Bouvier was a carpenter. His grandson upgraded the ancestors to titled aristocrats. By the time Big Edie got hold of the narrative, they were royal. That inflation across 3 generations is its own evidence of how a fabrication grows when nobody pushes back on it. Emma Bouvier, Michel's daughter, married into the Drexel family, connecting the Bouviers to Philadelphia's Catholic elite and solidifying the reputation of a prosperous French immigrant best remembered today as the ancestor of Jacqueline Bouvier. The social connections were genuine. The wealth was genuine. The coal was genuine. Every line of the lineage was fiction. The Bouviers weren't operating in isolation either. Wealthy American families had been manufacturing European credentials for decades by this point. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, families who made their money in railroads and real estate, and then spent fortunes marrying their daughters to impoverished European nobles in exchange for titles. But the Bouviers skipped even that transactional step. They simply wrote the aristocratic connection into existence, fabricating a genealogy without bothering to purchase the props. No republic in history has been more obsessed with the trappings of the very system it was founded to reject. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born in 1929 into a family whose public identity rested on a genealogical document that its author knew to be false. She didn't choose this inheritance, but she benefited from it enormously. Young Jackie cultivated what scholars have described as a concerted cultivation of a French aesthetic and sensibility. Her identity construction sat directly atop the foundation that Our Forebears had laid. French refinement, continental elegance, a woman whose style felt like birthright rather than ambition. That was the public-facing image. During her junior year abroad in France, her host sister Claude remembered that Jackie investigated her French roots during her year in the country. Whatever Jackie found in those archives, and the titled ancestors, the noble lines, the aristocratic connections that Our Forebears had so carefully constructed, wouldn't have been waiting in any French record office. Her French persona continued to deepen for the rest of her life. One scholar put it bluntly: the genealogy couldn't be verified because it was false, because her family origins were common. By documented ancestry, Jackie was only approximately 1/8 French. The overwhelming majority of her heritage was Anglo-Irish, and certainly nothing approaching aristocratic French. Her performance of Frenchness was exactly that, a performance, sustained by genuine will and genuine taste and genuine intelligence, resting on a genealogical foundation made of paper and ambition. The clothes, the accent, the cultural references, all of it deepened throughout her life. All of it was real talent. None of it was inherited bloodline. Her father, John Vernou Bouvier III, universally known as Blackjack for his perpetual tan and dark good looks, embodied the aristocratic persona at its most self-destructive. A stockbroker, a drinker, a man whose charm was legendary and whose reliability was a constant question mark. He represented the generation that inherited both the fabricated lineage and the coal and Wall Street money, and he spent both with the abandon of someone who believed replenishment was a birthright. Jackie and Lee grew up watching a man perform aristocracy, while the underlying assets eroded. The lesson each daughter drew from that performance would define the rest of their lives. Both sisters were smokers, too, a fact that seems minor until you register how aggressively the family image was curated to project effortless elegance and health. The cigarettes were hidden from photographs, tucked away during public appearances, denied in much the same way the Bouviers denied their carpenter ancestor. Behind the polished surface, something was always burning. Jackie drew a very specific lesson from her father's performance. It wasn't enough. You needed to marry real power, real money, real position, and then use your intelligence to build something durable. Her marriage to John F. Kennedy, then to Aristotle Onassis, these were the strategic moves of a brilliant woman who understood that the Bouvier name, for all its manufactured polish, wouldn't sustain her on its own. Jackie grasped what Lee never quite did: the fiction was a launching pad, not a landing strip, and she used it to propel herself into positions where her actual abilities could take over. Her later career as a book editor, first at Viking Press, then at Doubleday, represented something the Bouvier genealogy had never provided: genuine, earned accomplishment. She acquired manuscripts. She shepherded books to publication. She showed up to an office where her work was evaluated on its quality, not her surname. She put in the daily grind of editing and acquisitions, the kind of work that doesn't make society pages, but produces tangible results measured by bound pages and print runs, not tabloid mentions. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, the woman born into a fabricated genealogy and a self-destructing father's charm, built a professional life that stood on its own merits. The distance between that office at Doubleday and the pages of Our Forebears is the distance between substance and performance. And Jackie, to her credit, crossed it. Lee drew a different lesson from their father's example entirely. Where Jackie treated the aristocratic persona as a costume to be eventually outgrown, Lee treated it as an identity to be pursued and defended at all costs. Her 1959 marriage to Prince Stanislaw Albrecht Radziwill appeared to be the ultimate validation of the Bouvier aristocratic fantasy. A Bouvier daughter had finally married actual European nobility, and the Radziwill family was the real thing. One of the most powerful noble dynasties in the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Princes of the Holy Roman Empire, vast landowners, political kingmakers whose influence stretched back centuries. The name carried genuine historical weight, the kind of pedigree that Our Forebears had tried to fabricate out of thin air. But Poland had abolished aristocratic titles in its March Constitution of 1921. Decades before Lee or Stanislaw drew breath. The princess title she acquired through marriage had no legal standing in Poland, no legal recognition in the United States, no legal validity in the United Kingdom or France, where she later lived. Lee styled herself Princess anyway for the rest of her life, in a gesture so perfectly Bouvier it could have been lifted from the pages of Our Forebears itself. A woman from a family that had fabricated European aristocratic credentials, married into a family that had possessed real European aristocratic credentials, in a country that had legally eliminated those credentials before either bride or groom existed. The fabrication met the genuine article, and they canceled each other out. What remained was a styling, a word on an invitation, princess, that meant nothing in any court of law on earth, but meant everything in the drawing rooms where Lee wished to be received. Lee attempted a career in acting, and the results became their own kind of legend, though not the kind she intended. Her collaboration with Truman Capote was supposed to legitimize her as a serious performer, a woman whose talents extended beyond marriage and decoration. Instead, it became one of the most whispered-about failures of the 1960s social scene, notoriously unsuccessful, generating the sort of polite, devastating silence that follows a social failure among people too well-bred to say what everyone is thinking. No amount of patronage could manufacture what wasn't there. Lee pivoted to interior design. She attempted writing. Each new endeavor followed the same arc: enormous publicity at launch, because the princess was doing something, then quiet retreat when the work itself couldn't sustain the attention. The pattern repeated because the underlying dynamic never changed. Lee leaned on the name first, and the talent second. And the name, being fabricated on one side and legally extinct on the other, could never bear the weight she placed on it. Meanwhile, the aristocratic porcelain kept cracking in other rooms of the family mansion. Big Edie, the aunt who had proclaimed descent from 14th-century French kings, was by the early 1970s living in conditions that would have horrified the imaginary aristocrats in her family tree. On October 22, 1971, Her Grey Gardens estate in East Hampton was raided by the Suffolk County Health Department for documented violations of local ordinances. Inspectors found a crumbling house overrun with cats and raccoons. Big Edie had suffered financial collapse by then, selling off Tiffany silver and antique jewelry piece by piece, relying on a family stipend to survive. The health department, the same bureaucratic machinery that inspects restaurant kitchens, descended on the home of a woman who believed she was of royal blood. That was the Bouvier aristocracy stripped to its studs. A claim with no backing, a title with no treasury, a lineage with no foundation solid enough to keep a roof from caving in. Jackie did a lot of covering. If Lee Radziwill ended up with an estate reportedly valued at around $50 million, why did Jackie Kennedy Onassis spend years financially supporting her sister? The projected image was of two daughters of American aristocracy, equally at home in the world of wealth and privilege. The reality was starkly different. One sister had married into genuine power and genuine money, first Kennedy, then Onassis, while the other had married into a legally void title and a name that, however historically distinguished, came without a functioning treasury. Jackie paid bills. She funded lifestyles. She supported Lee the way the fictional aristocrats in the Bouvier genealogy never needed to be supported. Because real aristocrats had real land and real income producing real returns. The $50 million figure that appeared in reports of Lee's estate after her death raises an obvious question about where that money actually came from and when it accumulated. Because for decades, the evidence points to a woman whose lifestyle exceeded her independent means and whose sister quietly closed the gap. The Bouvier aristocracy was always a story, and stories don't pay rent. The $50 million question illuminates the distance between what the family projected and what was happening behind the closed doors of apartments that someone else was covering. The cigarettes burned through all of it, year after year, decade after decade. Jackie smoked. Lee smoked. They hid it the way they hid everything that contradicted the curated image. Not because smoking was rare among their social set, but because the aesthetic of effortless perfection couldn't accommodate anything as vulgar as addiction. Every hidden cigarette was Our Forebears in miniature, a truth suppressed in service of an image. The moment the Bouvier fabrication transformed from a genealogical curiosity into a moral litmus test arrived in the lives of Lee's two children, Anthony and Anna Christina Tina Radziwill. They inherited the Bouvier fiction and the legally void Radziwill title. They inherited the fundamental question both legacies posed. What do you do with a name that means everything to the world and nothing in substance? Anthony Radziwill chose work. He became a documentary filmmaker and television producer at ABC News, building a career that required him to show up, produce, meet deadlines, and earn the respect of colleagues who cared about the quality of his footage and nothing about whether his mother was styled princess. His reputation was built in editing bays and on location shoots, not at society dinners. Nobody at ABC cared about the Radziwill name when a deadline was coming and the footage wasn't cut. When he was diagnosed with cancer, first testicular, then a rare sarcoma, he kept working at ABC, living with an intentionality that didn't require a title or a genealogical footnote to validate it. His closest friend was his cousin by marriage, John F. Kennedy Jr., and their bond ran deep, rooted in genuine affection, mutual respect, and the shared experience of growing up inside America's most scrutinized families without letting the scrutiny define them. JFK Jr.'s plane went down off Martha's Vineyard on July 16, 1999, the result of a specific pilot decision to fly at night without instrument training in conditions that demanded it. Anthony was already dying. He survived his best friend by just weeks, passing away on August 10, 1999, at 39. The quiet dignity that people attribute to Anthony wasn't produced by the Bouvier genealogy or the Radziwill title. He produced it himself, day by day, choice by choice, in the face of a disease that stripped away every pretense and left only the person underneath. When everything decorative is removed, the structure either holds or it doesn't. Anthony's held. Tina Radziwill made an even more radical choice. Lee's daughter chose, deliberately and consistently, to withdraw from public life entirely. The Radziwill name held no apparent appeal for her, and the Bouvier connection offered nothing she wanted to leverage for magazine profiles or social currency. Interviews about her famous aunt, memoirs about growing up as the daughter of a princess. None of it materialized, because Tina simply declined. She walked away. And the very scarcity of public information about her is itself the most powerful statement any member of this family ever made. In a dynasty built on fabricated prestige, the most dignified act turned out to be silence. No book deal, no television appearance, no styling. Just a life lived on its own terms, unmediated by the expectations that came attached to names she hadn't chosen. Where the Bouviers had spent a century adding layers of varnish, thicker, shinier, more ornate, Tina stripped everything back to bare wood and found that the bare wood was enough. Carol Radziwill, who married Anthony, took a different path. She'd been a journalist before the marriage, with her own career and her own professional identity. After Anthony's death, she published a memoir in 2005, What Remains, a memoir of fate, friendship, and love. A book about grief and loss, written by a woman processing the death of a husband she'd watched deteriorate from cancer for years. Then, in 2014, she joined the cast of Real Housewives of New York City, appearing on the show from 2014 through 2018. Over those seasons, the Radziwill name became part of her television persona. The princess styling, the same styling that had no legal validity in any jurisdiction, surfaced as a recurring feature of her public brand on a Bravo reality show. Carol had her own accomplishments before the marriage. She had a journalism career that predated the Radziwill name, but the trajectory from journalism to grief memoir to reality television traced a specific arc, and the audience watching that arc drew its own conclusions about what was earned and what was leveraged. The contrast with Tina was sharp enough to cut. One woman who inherited the name by birth walked away from it without a backward glance. Another who acquired it through marriage put it on cable television. Lee herself was, by multiple accounts, not a particularly attentive mother. Her priorities, social positioning, the rivalry with Jackie, interior decoration projects, the acting attempts that Capote couldn't salvage, the writing attempts that went nowhere, occupied the foreground of a life that kept its children at a manageable distance. The aristocratic performance consumed the hours and the emotional bandwidth that might otherwise have gone toward the unglamorous, repetitive, essential work of raising two children. Anthony and Tina became remarkable people despite their mother's attention, not because of it. Whatever character they possessed, they forged in the gap between what Lee projected and what she actually provided. That gap, between image and substance, between the title on the invitation and the person in the room, was the central inheritance of every Bouvier who ever lived. Jackie Kennedy Onassis died first. Lee Radziwill died years later. The manufactured genealogy outlived both of them. Our Forebears still exists, still sits in whatever archives or attics still hold it, still contains the same fictitious lineage that John Vernou Bouvier Jr. composed, knowing it was false. The titles survived too, in a sense. People still call Lee a princess in obituaries and retrospectives, still repeat the aristocratic framing that mainstream media has never quite been willing to abandon, because abandoning it means admitting they'd been repeating a lie for 60 years. Obituary writers and documentary narrators keep genuflecting to a fiction because the alternative, stating plainly that the emperor had no clothes and never did, requires a kind of honesty that apparently remains uncomfortable even decades after the evidence became public record. But the coal money ran out. Stock portfolios fluctuated and occasionally collapsed. Grey gardens fell apart. The cigarettes kept burning behind closed doors, year after year, the one honest thing about the whole performance. And the princess title remained legally void from 1921 until the end of time. Michel Bouvier, the actual physical man who started this family in America, built beautiful furniture, by all accounts, during those golden years between 1820 and 1840. Crafted with skill and sold on merit, no title required, no genealogical footnote attached, just wood, shaped well by a man who never pretended to be anything other than what he was. Everything on this earth is temporary. The Bouviers spent generations constructing an aristocratic fiction. Some family members spent their entire lives performing it. Others walked away and built something real. The titles, the money, the 50 million, the princess styling, all of it's temporary. The only thing that survives any of us is the character we actually possessed. Anthony Radziwill knew that. Tina Radziwill knows it still. The rest is furniture polish on a carpenter's legacy. Subscribe for more stories like this.